But, landing in Brundisium, soldiers raced to Rome to deliver the news to Augustus, who dropped what he was doing and rushed to Brundisium. But by the time he got there, it was too late. Marcus Agrippa was dead. It would be difficult to overstate what a blow this was. Agrippa was basically the reason Augustus had gotten anywhere in life. The inherited name of Julius Caesar was obviously the catalyst for his rise, and the savvy advice of Maecenas helped him pick his way through the treacherous world of Roman politics. But it would all have been for naught without victories on the battlefield, and all of Augustus's most important victories, against first Sextus Pompey and then Mark Antony, had been won by Agrippa. The death of the great general at age 51 was a harsh reminder that while he was now all-powerful, Augustus never really had been able to do it alone. The question of what would happen the next time a key military victory was required must have weighed heavy on Augustus's mind, because not only had he been able to trust Agrippa to win the battle, but he could also trust Agrippa not to betray him afterwards. The next great battle, if such a thing occurred, would be fraught with danger for the regime. Defeat would mean a loss of legitimacy, while victory would mean a new rival for power. The death of Agrippa was bad news for Augustus, no matter which way you sliced it. But that did not mean Augustus was going to simply cash in his chips or linger too long over the death of his friend. After escorting Agrippa's body back to Rome, Augustus placed the remains in his own recently constructed mausoleum, so at least in death, the two friends would be reunited. But when he closed the doors on the tomb, it was time to move on. The key question was what to do with his now twice-widowed daughter Julia. He mulled over, but then dismissed the idea of marrying her to an ally outside the family. No, Augustus wanted to keep everything in a nice, tight little bundle, so he settled on marrying her to Tiberius. The only problem was that Tiberius was happily married to Vipsania, and he had no desire to marry the woman who had so recently been his stepmother-in-law. He and Vipsania had already produced a healthy son named Nero Claudius Drusus, named unusually after his uncle rather than Tiberius himself, as was the custom. But when Augustus made up his mind, he made up everybody's mind. Tiberius was forced to divorce Vipsania and marry Julia. The bitterness over the incident grew slowly in Tiberius, sparked at first simply by his longing for Vipsania, but then nursed into a full-blown fiery rage when he really got to know his new wife. The problem was that the two were simply not compatible. Tiberius was conservative, thoughtful, and at times an admittedly humorless man. He was smart, talented, and ambitious, but embraced none of the flamboyance that had come to mark Julia's personality. As the only daughter of Augustus, Julia had been raised in a pampered world of wealth and privilege. But now that she was grown up, she was not daddy's little girl anymore. She was now simply a pawn in her father's dynastic games. Never one to consider his daughter's feelings, Augustus married her off as was politically expedient, and then took her sons Gaius and Lucius away at the first opportunity. In response, Julia began to act out against her father's obsession with traditional morality and proceeded to carry on affairs with Rome's leading men, essentially making a fool out of Augustus behind his moralizing back. Tiberius stepped into the situation and soon found himself playing the cuckold. But as much as Tiberius disdained his new wife, it seems that Julia was no great fan of Tiberius's either. She even sent a letter to her father through an intermediary denouncing Tiberius as unworthy of her hand in marriage and beneath her. After their only child died in infancy, Tiberius seems to have renounced marital relations with Julia, not that she cared. After Agrippa died, Tiberius inherited not just the general's widow, but also his command in Pannonia. Drusus, meanwhile, was placed in charge of the armies of the Rhine, and in contrast to Tiberius's unhappy private life, found his own family a source of great joy. His marriage to Antonia was a happy one and produced 3 children, each destined for a life in the public eye. Drusus returned the compliment Tiberius had paid him by naming his own eldest son, born in either 16 or 15 BC, Nero Claudius Tiberius. Of course, we know the boy today by the agnomen he inherited from his father, Germanicus. Filling out the family was Julia Livilla, born in 13 BC, and the reversely named Tiberius Claudius Nero, born in 10 BC. Obviously, the Romans were not much for unique naming, so from here on out, I'll be referring to them as Germanicus, Livilla, and Claudius, respectively. And in case you didn't already know, yes, that Claudius. The young family was the toast of the Roman world. Drusus, unlike his sad sack and socially awkward older brother, was outgoing and universally popular. Antonia herself soon joined the auspicious ranks of Cornelia Africana, mother of the Gracchi brothers, and her own mother Octavia, as a near-deified paragon of womanly virtue. When Drusus died, she refused to remarry, eventually living another 5 decades without ever taking a new husband, a highly unusual state of affairs. From 11 BC to 9 BC, the 2 stepsons of Augustus battled their way into hostile territory. Tiberius had the easier time of it because, as I said, the tribes of Pannonia remained too disconnected to really prove a match for the legions. But Germania was a different story. The tribes there were larger, tougher, and more strategically advanced than the natives in Pannonia. Drusus was able to eventually push his armies all the way to the Elbe, but every winter he was forced to withdraw back to the safety of Gaul. When they faced Drusus in battle, the Germans usually lost, but that in no way led to anything resembling an atmosphere of conquest. Like the Romans themselves, the Germans could lose all the battles in the world and still never admit defeat. In 9 AD, a Roman general named Publius Varus would make the mistake of thinking the Germans a conquered people and lead 3 legions into a disaster that would see the Romans more or less withdraw from Germania forever. The dream of a border on the Elbe River abandoned. Disaster struck the royal family, and really that's what they were, a royal family. In the late summer of 9 BC, he had been winding down a successful year in the consulship and was preparing to take on proconsular authority and follow his brother up the chain of command. But just like that, his career and his life were cut short. The injuries he sustained from the fall likely became infected, and he was simply unable to recover. In a touching tribute to the bond shared by the brothers, Tiberius raced across 200 miles of hostile territory, accompanied by a single Gallic guide when he heard the news. Unlike Augustus racing to meet Agrippa, Tiberius was able to make it in time, but just barely. Soon after his brother's arrival, Drusus died. Tiberius led the body back to Rome and was soon joined by Augustus and Livia, who was beside herself with grief at the loss of her son. As I said, Antonia never remarried. She moved in with Augustus and Livia, and her children were raised alongside their older cousins, Gaius and Lucius. The next year brought only more bad news for Augustus. Maecenas, his longtime friend and key political advisor during the rise to power, died in October, leaving Augustus alone at the top. There is something indispensable about advisors who are around before power is won, who can speak plainly and directly without succumbing to awe. Augustus was fast running out of such men, and the 2 most important were now dead. Augustus, for so long the young man fighting his elders for power, was now himself the elder, surrounded by younger men whose relationship to him was inalterably colored by his supreme power. Augustus was never lonely or lacking for company, but at this point, the only person left who resembled both a friend and an equal was Livia. There was much speculation about why he remained with her after it became apparent that their marriage would never produce children. But perhaps she gave him access to an easy familiarity that he would be unable to find anywhere else. File that under pure speculation, though. With Agrippa and Drusus dead, the only man ready to step into power now, should Augustus die, was Tiberius. Probably out of consideration for this fact, Tiberius was promoted to a status not unlike that attained by Agrippa after Augustus's brush with death in 23 BC. After taking over his brother's command in Germania, he served as consul in 7 BC, and was then granted the same power at the tribunate that Augustus enjoyed. Once his year in the consulship was over, Augustus had slated Tiberius to head east and oversee another intervention into Armenia, where a pro-Parthian monarch had recently ascended the throne. But Tiberius shocked everyone when he suddenly announced that he would be doing no such thing, that, in fact, he was retiring from public life for good. Historians, both ancient and modern, have puzzled over Tiberius's inexplicable retirement. Some posit that he could see plainly that he was simply a temporary placeholder, that he would be forced to step aside for Gaius and Lucius eventually, so why waste his life clearing the way for his younger stepbrothers? Others say that he actually had the teenager's best interests at heart and was removing himself from the stage so there would be no competition for the public's attention. And, of course, on a more personal level, everyone likes to point out how unhappy the marriage between Tiberius and Julia was, and that when he retired, he was retiring as much from her as he was from politics. Whatever the real reason, in 6 BC, the one man Augustus would feel comfortable turning over the empire to walked away from him. Augustus was enraged by his stepson's betrayal, and when the princeps announced Tiberius's decision to the Senate, his remarks made it very clear that he was taking the whole thing personally. But despite the heavy pressure exerted on him to reconsider, Tiberius packed his bags and sailed for Rhodes, the island he had chosen for his self-imposed exile. It's hard to tell what to make of the episode. Did Tiberius really think he was leaving public life behind, or was it all some elaborate charade designed to prove how indispensable he was? To partially answer the question, I think we can look to the fact that while Tiberius gave up formal office when he left for Rhodes, he conspicuously did not give back the at-large powers the Senate had bestowed upon him. One suspects that Tiberius was not done with politics just yet. Tiberius's announcement left Augustus in a bind. Gaius and Lucius, at this point, were only 14 and 11. If the princeps died, who would take over? Because they certainly weren't ready. Tiberius could always be returned from retirement, but this whole self-imposed exile thing would make it very difficult to arrange for a peaceful transfer of power. If Tiberius was still retired when Augustus died, other ambitious men would seize on the opportunity to lay their own claim on the throne. Since that certainly wouldn't do, Augustus was left with no other choice. He simply had to keep living. One way or the other, he would have to stay alive long enough to see Gaius and Lucius come of age and establish a place in Roman public life for themselves. Next week, fate will continue to mock Augustus's plan for a permanent dynasty. While the princeps focused on outliving the childhoods of his two grandsons, he was not prepared to outlive them completely. But when death came calling, first for Lucius and then for Gaius, the princeps could only stand by helplessly as his young heirs were stolen away from him. To make matters worse, by the time the two boys died, Augustus had already banished Julia from Rome when somebody finally told him what she had been up to all these years. With his only daughter wasting away in exile and his two prized grandsons dead, the family Augustus had worked so hard to build and protect was now in shambles. The Julian line could no longer stand on its own 2 feet. It would need a transfusion of blood from the Claudians to survive. Before we go, I would like to take a personal moment here, as today is Mother's Day in the United States. Mom, I know you're like 3 episodes behind the pace, so this won't get to you for another week or 2. But wherever you are, probably trucking around the neighborhood, happy Mother's Day. I love you. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome, episode